Hello and welcome, I'm Tafara Gadamu. On February 1937, during the brief Italian occupation of Ethiopia, an attempt was made on the life of Rodolfo Graziani, who was then Mussolini's viceroy. Contrary to what has been established thus far, my guest today, Lan Campbell, in his new book, The Plot to Kill Graziani, argues that the story was far more complicated and the actors too many. Lan Campbell, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Affile, a small town where Rodolfo Graziani grew up, unveiled this past month a monument in his honor. Was that something outrageous?
Yes, on the one hand, it is a shocking thing because the world had come to realize that fascism was something very dangerous, something very terrible. So it shouldn't have happened. It's a scary thing to have happened because to an outsider, it looks at least like some sort of neo-fascism coming up in Italy. On the other hand, we have to remember Graziani was commander-in-chief of the military in Italy for many years and is regarded very highly as a soldier, as a commander. The world is full of statues of people who have done terrible things. I think the explanation with this paradox between constructing a monument to fascism, as it appears, and a village honouring its son, is the fact that the atrocities which the Italian fascists committed during the 1930s and the 1920s in Libya are not generally known. And the reason they're not generally known is that none of the war criminals ever went to trial.
But he did. The Italian tribunal, sentenced him to, 19 years? He only served 4 months and was released, or something to that effect?
Graziani's imprisonment had nothing to do with war crimes. It's purely coincidental. It's a side issue. When Italy decided to change sides, when it saw that the Allies would probably win the war, Graziani was one of the very few people who was loyal to his boss, Mussolini. So he collaborated with Hitler. He remained loyal to fascism, when the rest of the country forgot about fascism almost overnight. So he was imprisoned for continuing to collaborate with Adolf Hitler after the rest of the government had changed its policy. Had nothing to do with war crimes, either in Ethiopia or anywhere else. So, the main reason why probably most Italians, especially young Italians, have no idea that Graziani did these terrible things is because neither he nor any of the other fascist war criminals ever went to trial, unlike the Germans, forcing Germany to come to terms with Nazism. And it was the British government who sabotaged the war crimes trials, which Ethiopia had planned through the UN. So because of that sabotage, it's not generally known, even in Italy, that people like Graziani did these terrible things.
Let's come back to your book, The Plot to Kill Graziani. You established your own way. There were not only 2 people in the name of Abraha Deboch and Mogus Askedom, as conventional wisdom has it, but there were a few more to the plot, and you mentioned at least 6 people, including the 2. That is pretty daring, isn't it?
It's certainly a rewriting of conventional history, if you like, of the early 20th century Ethiopia, or at least of the occupation period. The interesting thing is that I had no idea that that would be the case. When I started this research, it was part of a study of the monastery of Debre Libanos, which, as you know, suffered a terrible massacre
After the
because Mogus Askedom and Abraha Deboch went to the monastery after making the attack on
and also
Graziani.
before that.
And even before that, had some associations with the monastery. So my intention at the time was just to do a 20-minute research to find out who were these 2 people and why did they throw this bomb. So I was new to Ethiopia. It was the late 1980s, and I just wanted to know who they were, and no one could tell me. So when I and my friend De Giffey, who has passed away unfortunately, when we started looking at this, we found to our surprise that other names and connections started emerging from eyewitnesses who knew Abraham Mogus at the time and who were still alive. So to me, it was a big surprise every time it happened that I found that, well, actually, there was more to this than meets the eye. It was a shock to me. So what the book sets out is what came to light over a period of 20 years. The more I asked about the connections, the more I got the connections, the more I asked about them, the more new threads of the story started appearing. So yes, the net result of all of this was a picture completely different, or at least much more complex than the conventional wisdom. And it was only after all this was finished that I started to ask myself, half a minute, this doesn't conform to what people were telling me earlier. Why, how could that be? And that's when the book, as a book,
started evolving.
Well, to gel. Yes.
But Abraha and Mogus, the two figures that we know, young, daring people, personalities, threw the bomb at the end of the day. The four that you've mentioned who were part of the plot, at least four, were quite often on the periphery.
On the periphery. That's what it looked like from one angle as I got towards the end of the research. It now appears that there could have been more people throwing the hand grenades, possibly, not only Mogus and...
But you don't establish that in your book, do you?
You
tend to suggest and show the possibilities, but not necessarily the...
Correct. It's not completely clear yet who those people might have been.
So unless you decide that there were more people who threw the hand grenades, then the fact remains that this were only the two people who did the whole...
So far, the only two we know of who actually threw the grenades was Mogus Askodom and Abradabach.
But doesn't that make them stick out in the whole plot?
Yes, it does.
So doesn't that allow us to believe that these were the only people who did the job?
Yes, but in fact it now appears that they were, if you like, the implementers of the plot. They were, in a sense, used. The book shows that, to begin with, there was indeed a plot, not a very precise plot, but there was an intent by two people, Sabat Trune, who died in prison, and Mogus Askodom. They had their intentions, and Abraha joined them later on, after a few weeks or months. But they maybe didn't have enough of a critical mass to really organize themselves. So their plot, if you like, becomes subsumed by a larger plot of very high-ranking former dignitaries in the emperor's government, who then used their enthusiasm and energy to actually implement the plot, but that it was taken to some extent out of their hands. And I think that explains why, in the end, it was a bit of a fiasco, because actually no one was killed, apart from tens of thousands of Ethiopians, which wasn't really what they had in mind.
At least three or more of them, whom you mentioned as part of the plot in the process, were not actually involved in the process. One of them, for example, drove a car, and that's the reason why he was involved. But you cannot say that he was intimately involved, and I don't see that in your book.
Well, each character that appears in the story of the plot has a part that he played, which is based on largely on circumstantial evidence, but very compelling circumstantial evidence. So the case of Simeon Adifris, for example. We know that Simeon was meeting with Mogus and Abraha right up until the evening before. We know that he was meeting with Letliebelu Gebri. We know that a relative of Letliebelu Gebri saw a letter from London, from Hirui and Ephraim to Oldemedin and Lorenzo Tazar, asking him to be involved. So you get very compelling situations which arose, which each on their own wouldn't prove anything, but the sum totality of those circumstantial events make it almost certain that there was indeed a cause and effect. Like talking to the family of the late Bediron, or Dejazmach Letliebelu as he became, they all knew he was involved. And it says so in his obituary, but no one had ever picked up on it. So yes, it could be a sort of 1,000,000 to 1 chance that there was it was all coincidence, that all these people were meeting in a clandestine manner and receiving letters and so on. But it's most unlikely that there would be no cause and effect. So it's a matter really of putting together very powerful circumstantial evidence. There's the evidence of the witness who saw a letter asking Letliebelu to organize such an event because of the danger of the emperor losing his seat in the League of Nations, which was very much the case at the end of 1936. By November, December 1936, the position of Ethiopia in the League was becoming very, very tenuous. So, and then you have Bashawaret Habtewald, who I was able to discover was actually meeting with Mogus and Abraha just that last evening, and I was able to talk to his wife and his sister-in-law, who actually met him that evening, and he said he'd been with Abraha Deboch, and he had an argument with his family, telling them that Abraha, I can trust him, he's a good man, he's not really a spy. So there were so many of these linkages that came up from people who hadn't met each other, who would have no reason for telling me things that were not true, that it tied up to such a tight case that I thought, well, this really needs to be published.
So you're talking to the descendants of the persons who were involved in the plot, right?
Not only the descendants and colleagues.
And colleagues
and colleagues.
And, you know, in a couple of cases, brothers and so on.
Yes. Two of the most outstanding of the witnesses, one was the late Blatter Mahari Kasa, who died at the age of 103, who was very close to both Abraha and Mogus and had been with them during the weeks coming up to the event. And one gentleman, who I still see around, lived with Mogus in the same room right up until the day, and was able to reconstruct for me who visited them, who did they visit, with the most phenomenal memory, which never failed. It was always the same as to when they came and when they left, and so on and so on and so on. And the family of Bashawaret Habtewald were both very articulate, and they both passed away now, and were able to enable me to construct such a tight schedule of events, in some cases to the nearest quarter of an hour, that I became quite certain that I was getting very reliable information.
Why did Abraha and Mogus finally decided to go and do the stuff by themselves? Because you see a marked split towards the end.
That is the most difficult question to answer.
Because they were working together, you established that. The logical conclusion would be that they would act together. But towards the end,
it's only it's fragmented.
Exactly. Why did that happen?
Disorganized. In the book, I try to stick to what I know with some reasonable degree of certainty to be true. I try not to speculate too much. But on this point, I just put one or two hypotheses. And the first hypothesis, really, perhaps the most likely, is that fundamentally there was a difference of motivation between the various parties. Some of the people who appear to have promised to help were of maybe doubtful commitment. Take Makon Deniker, for example. Did he really commit himself to helping in this plot? He was working for the Carabinieri, for the Italian police. He was a professional policeman. He wasn't a politician. So maybe some of the people's commitment was not total. In the case of Letya Belugebri himself, as I point out in the book, he was not really an ideal leader of a clandestine plot.
Yeah, he was pretty much
more
funky.
An administrator, more of a well-to-do figure. Then you have Mogus Askodom himself. When he emerges, not Abraha, Mogus emerges as the driving force, which again is another different conclusion. People assumed it's Abraha Debach because he was outgoing. He was the more dynamic of the personalities. But my research into Mogus Askodom leads me to believe that he was the most committed. He was an idealist. He would have done this purely on a point of principle. He was absolutely orthodox Christian, very, very loyal to his cause, very patriotic to Ethiopia, very stable personality.
And so was Abraham.
So I think he was totally committed, regardless, well, even if the big men, as it were, let them down at the last minute, he was totally committed. Abraha was extremely energetic, but he had been wavering. He was a Baha'i at one time. Then he was working for the Italians. Then he was inspired by Mogus and Sabat Tarune and became committed to that cause. Maybe at the same time he was keeping his options open. So you had a range of different people. That could partly explain the fact that it seemed to fall apart. The other reason, as I mentioned, is communications. You had the same problem in mid-1936 when the Patriot armies tried to retake Addis Ababa, and they had no way of communicating. The result was similar, if you look at it. A great deal of commitment, but not sufficiently coordinated to have the effect that was planned.
So eventually these two guys got to get
They went
together
ahead anyway.
and went ahead and
Yes.
did what they did.
And my feeling is that the reason why they didn't get much support from anybody else, my feeling, it's only a feeling, is that the level of firepower which the Italians had put around the Gonetta Lowell Palace was so enormous, because they'd been tipped off,
Yeah.
that anyone in his right mind would have said, okay, let's postpone this. This is not, we're not going to achieve anything today.
So that's a possibility. That most of the
The
actors...
military people, such as Letya Belugebri, for example, he was a military man. He would have seen immediately that this is not the day. Mogus, on the other hand, was a very dedicated young man, and he would have said, no, this is our commitment, we must do it. So that could explain the fact that some of the members appeared to dissolve, to fade away.
It's interesting. Where does this commitment come from? The two guys came across the border from Eritrea to Ethiopia, and basically they were outsiders when they...
Abraha was trying to get promotion within the Italian system. And at the time he was trying to get promotion, a new law was brought in that completely changed his position.
He's always an outsider.
This is the new racial laws of fascism, which were not there earlier. When he first came to Ethiopia, he would have had very good prospects with the Italian general government here. So Abraha's prospects were killed overnight by a new law brought in by Minister Lasona, which basically said that native Italian subjects have no prospects beyond a very low level of education and employment. So he definitely wanted to restore his social capital with the Ethiopians for very good reason. He had no prospects with the Italians. So there could have been an element of opportunism there. In Mogus's case, since the book came out, the family of Mogus Askodom have emerged into my world, and they're wonderful people. They've been very helpful. They live in America, Sweden, England, as well as Eritrea. And they've assisted me to do quite a lot more research on Mogus. And we've been able to piece together much more of his early childhood than is to be found in the book. And we've also pieced together more of what happened after the event.
Which points to what?
Which points to Mogus being far more driven by principles of Orthodox Christianity than I had realized. I knew he was Orthodox, but that was as far as it went. Mogus was so loyal to his faith and so strong in his belief. Even as a child, he was smacked by his family because he refused to drink milk on a Wednesday and a Friday, even as a child. And he was brought here at his own request by priests from Eritrea. And I even now have a letter, an actual letter he wrote to the priest who arranged for him to come, saying he's now at Tafari Mekonnen School. And the way the letter's written, his usage of words and his handwriting and so on, clearly show that here is someone brought up in the church. He was educated in the Debre Bizen. You can't get much higher than Debre Bizen in the Eritrean Orthodox Church. He was sent there by his father and his elder brother because he was so devout, even as a child. So he had a very, very strict Orthodox upbringing. I don't think he ever wavered. I think he decided at a very early stage that the Italians were in the wrong. They should never be here, regardless of the fact that he should have been a loyal, if you like, Italian colonial subject. And I think from what I'm told by the person who lived with him, who I've now been able to introduce to Mogus's family, which has been a wonderful development, that he was absolutely the driving force over Abraha. And it was a solid commitment, nothing political, nothing personal. He did it because it was the right thing to do, and he wouldn't be deflected. So I think each personality had his own story to tell.
Will your opinion on Abraha change with more information coming perhaps in the future, the way you...
It could. I'm still hoping to get more
information. Would that be redefining your thesis, you think?
No, I think, I mean, it could, and if it does, then I would be more than willing to show that the...
but this far you have explored whatever you can.
On the Abraha side, I've learned a little bit more, but I still hope to get more about Abraha. So far, everything I've come across additional has reinforced my tentative conclusions as to the whys and wherefores. The other thing that I've got more information on now is the mystery of what happened to Mogus and Abraha. How could it be that the two greatest icons of 1930s Ethiopia, that no one knows what happened to them? People say they were shot accidentally by Ethiopians. And of course that...
But you have established that he was in Kwara.
In fact, he was executed by the Italians. And that's a tentative conclusion in the book. But now I know it's true, because I've found more people who were around at the time. And he was executed by the Italians. How this story came about, that he was shot accidentally by patriots, I have no idea. But certainly they were executed by the Italians, and they had a state funeral. They had a funeral first in Gondar, which I didn't know, organized by Andagacho Masai, who at that time was a governor in Gondar before he went to Asmara. Yes. And I've also been able to piece together where they disappeared to between throwing the bombs and turning up the same evening at Kachene. I found that they were hiding.
Which was a walking distance anyway.
Yes, that they were hiding in the mission church compound up on the Ntoto Road. So I've been able to piece together more or less hour by hour where they were and what they were doing. So the revised version will fill gaps, but it won't change the findings. If anything, it will strengthen them so far.
But then the emperor, who was in exile in London, his influence was very minimal, wasn't it? It wasn't that strong.
It probably was minimal, but it was much more substantial than was thought.
Yeah.
People assumed that here's the emperor drinking tea and coffee in England while everyone else is doing the work here. What my studies show so far is that the emperor almost certainly gave the green light for this to go ahead, which is probably why he was so silent about it after it went wrong, because a whole generation of people that he had personally arranged to go overseas, who would be the inheritors, if you like, of the government of Ethiopia, were all killed. And I think he was very embarrassed and very distraught about this. So I'm fairly certain he must have given the green light. It's inconceivable that his men would have gone this far to ask for this public expression of resistance to take place.
But there were several patriots who were on their own.
Yes, yeah, they were on their own. But I think, yes, his influence would have been acquiescence and asking for something to be done. But he wouldn't have been involved, I don't suppose, beyond that. But I think he was sufficiently involved to be very embarrassed, which is why, for example, the monument, which he personally put up in the early 1940s, makes no mention of Mogus or Abraha, as does not the present monument. It's purely a commemoration of the martyrs who died. It says nothing positive about the people who threw the bombs.
Particularly, these two guys wanted to be heroes, but they weren't recognized as heroes up until when?
Yes,
15, 16 years.
They sort of died in obscurity until the question of the unity with Eritrea came up. And it does appear that the late General Nega Haile Selassie, there were two by that name, this is the one who was running the government liaison office in Asmara, was basically in charge of orchestrating this iconography, if you like, of Mogus and Abraha as part of a demonstration that indeed there are heroes who are of Eritrean origin who were patriotic to Ethiopia. And therefore there was really no distinction. Why did the Italians kill all these Ethiopians if the people who threw the hand grenades were Eritreans? And it was a fair point. So you have a certain point by the late 40s, early 50s, where out of the blue, all the spotlight is on Mogus and Abraha, but with no investigations as to the totality of the plot. No mention of all the other people who might have been involved, or even Simon Adefris, who definitely was part of the plot, and who drove them to Debre Libanos and was executed by the Italians. No mention of him. So that definitely had a strong political dimension to it. From that moment on, Mogus, Askedam and Abraha Debach become heroes for Ethiopia.
Icons of resistance.
Yes, but yes, icons. But up until that time, their names were hardly known. They had faded into obscurity.
Well, Lan Campbell, thank you very much for coming to the show. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.